Now, we've set it up this morning the way the Pleasant Hill Shakers would have worshiped. It's a community in Kentucky that many of us visited. Dorothy Pryor and I went there together the last time we went to the mountain, when we used to have our summer retreats in North Carolina at a place called a Unitarian Retreat Center called the Mountain. And the service this morning is based on what we had demonstrated for us, part of what we had demonstrated for us in their architecture. The men and women would start sitting out like we are in a big square, though the men and the women would at this point be separated. Behind them and hidden, looking down from the second story in little square windows, would be the man and the woman minister. The purpose of those two ministers, whom I'm going to ask Brother Richard and Sister Kathleen to be this morning for us while we're dancing, is to observe the people who are sitting out to see if they could be converted. Because this was the greatest possible Sunday afternoon, in fact, probably the only Sunday afternoon entertainment for all the wide countryside around. And people used to come and sit in the back rows and look in through the windows. And since it was a completely democratic polity and the male minister and the female minister did not participate in an authoritarian mode anyway, they would look and see if you were kind of itching to dance or looked like you might want to be a shaker after all. The Shakers were founded, as Barbara said, by Ann Lee, and she lived between 1736 and 1784. She was born in Manchester, England, where she met a sect of shaking Quakers. Well, Quakers already quote, but the shaking Quakers quote more. Now, Quaker was actually a term of derision, like Yankee was for American, for the Society of Friends, whom the Quakers, whom you remember, were organized on entirely non-hierarchical lines, and who understood God as an inner light within each individual. Now, Anne was forced very young into marriage, and when I say forced into marriage, your parents simply would insist that you leave the house and marry such and such a person, or they couldn't support you anymore and they wanted you out. And she was forced into marriage against her will with a Manchester blacksmith, and all four of the children, who were born in quick succession, subsequently died very young in infancy. The experience shattered her. You have to remember that this time, the sequence was you got married, you had child after child after child, maybe up to 7 or 8 or 9. Half of them died, and then you probably died. The life expectancy was 47 for men and women. And she thought that the pursuit of her spiritual life would be better enhanced if she founded a solvent community for both men and women. Now, it's fascinating to me, because we are celebrating the 4th of July with this looking into the Quaker polity, that in 1776, the first Shaker community was founded in Watervliet, New York. And somebody whistling the Yankee Doodle over there. And you will remember that this was the time when the Declaration of Independence was being read all over the country. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Well, we all know, to our great sadness, that that did not mean what it said, and that it has taken us to this very day and still fighting hard to try to put it into effect. Here are the principles, again, a contract, a covenant, which the Shakers put into immediate effect and which they lived by for the whole duration of their religion. 1, equality of the sexes in all departments of life, men and women sharing equally the positions of both spiritual and temporal authority and responsibilities, and equally deserving of respect, religious leaders of both sexes. 2, equality of labor, all working for each and each for all. Separately as brothers and sisters doing different chores, but as my women's studies class had to be told by an Ojibwe woman in Wisconsin, when the men in my tribe do one thing and the women do another, it's not sexism, it's called gender complementarity. And you have to remember that that can happen in a structure. Their buildings, they work separately, and that's why their buildings have a mirror-like structure, because there was something for men and something for women. 3, equality of property. There shall be no rich and no poor, each using according to their need. If that sounds familiar to you, it should be, because in the latter part of the Shakers, of the Shaker religion's life, they had a very charismatic minister who went to Europe and lectured all over the place. And Friedrich Engels was fascinated by this, and it was included in Marx's Communist Manifesto. The Shakers called themselves communists, they called themselves socialists. They used those words to describe their economic polity. 4, freedom of speech. Though persecuted themselves, they never persecuted. 5, abolition of slavery, including freedmen and women, former slaves, in their polity. 6, temperance in all things. 7, justice and kindness for all living beings. 8, practical benevolence. And 9, true democracy based on the golden rule. Now, these are the principles of an intentional community at a time when intentional communities were being maintained all over the country, including quite a few Unitarian and Universalist ones. I think we all think of Brook Farm, but there were several other Universalist ones around the Boston area, and my own ancestors lived in a Universalist commune called the Hygeia community. Hygeia is the Greek goddess of health. The Shaker theology was unique. They weren't actually called the Shakers. They were called the United Society of Believers in Christ's Second Appearing. All right, just so you know. Their theology was not Trinitarian, just as ours is not Trinitarian. As in the Quakers, God is within you. A spiritual force and light within you that springs up as the fountain of all good life, light, truth, and love, and is worshipped as Father-Mother. Jesus was understood as the Christ Spirit, or God's manifestation in male form. And guess who was the Mother Spirit, God's manifestation in female form? Mother Ann was understood to be the female Jesus. A very important way to this inner light, besides prayer and meditation, was the expression of your unique individual creativity. In your carpentry is the divine light. In your writing is the divine light. In your cooking is the divine light manifest. The result of this was the most incredible outpouring of different forms of creativity you can possibly imagine. We're really thinking a lot about the music this morning, but they created art, needlework. They were incredible inventors and engineers. They held up over 100 patents. And as some of you know, they also had wonderful design. They had good architecture design. You can see it in their buildings. And the design of furniture and furnishings was unique. And in their worship services in the form of music and dance. And we've talked about that a little this morning. I'll read a contemporary account of their dance. A song of much animation was sung, and we're going to do this morning, all joining in its easy flowing strains and all keeping time to the music with rather elegant gesticulation on the part of the women. Please see this. And not very ungraceful on that of the men. A rather striking and constant motion of the hands and feet was kept up. The men and women moved forward at this one time of the week to dance together. And Grace told me not to say this, but it was called promiscuous dancing. And that's what they called it, but that's the way they understood it. And they actually would, as you'll see, touch hands in these dances. Now, before we try this out, there is always the question of what on earth happened to the Shakers, and what you hear is, well, they were celibate. What did you expect? They died out. No, 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 no. I did study their history. I wanted to make an analogy to some self-sustaining communities I was writing about it at the time. I did discover a little factoid that the average duration of a Shaker community was 146 years. That was interesting. Their membership came from two principal sources: new converts, of which there were many, because this was the period of the Great Awakening, when there were Methodist and Baptist revivals going all over the place, and people in America were generally getting born again. And that conversion included whole families. Husbands and wives came with all of their children. The second source for the Shakers were the orphans, of which there were many, and that included farm children who had parents, but whose parents' farm would not sustain them. They would come. During the period between 1862 and 1892, they described themselves as both pacifist and socialist, and their teachings were known all over the world, particularly in Europe. Here's what happened, I think. This is the Pratt hypothesis of the Shaker democracy, but I have studied it a bit. When a family came in, they sold all their goods and money and put them into the common Shaker pot. Their extended families were not happy about this, and often vandalized and attacked and wrote editorials against the Shakers for that reason. Once the canals and railroads came in, orphans whose local farms couldn't support them, as well as quite a few other people, could go someplace else and look for jobs. And also, revivals were no longer sweeping the country. I found a quote by 8 of the Pleasant Hill community that Dorothy and I visited. By 1910, there were only a few Shakers left, and the village was closed because of changing social attitudes in the Industrial Revolution. Well, one of the things that happened was that the Shakers were immensely successful, particularly in their furniture business. They exported them out to towns all around. And as the Industrial Revolution rose and capitalism became the thing, it wasn't just their communal organization that was offensive, it was their success. And I wouldn't be surprised if some of that vandalizing and attacking took place, stirring the local people up on the part of the competition. So today we celebrate our Declaration of Independence and the birth of our nation. Somewhat, I hope you are, as I am, a little bit chagrined that we ourselves, as the wider American community, are still struggling so hard with those principles, but delighted to celebrate a community that achieved them and that lived out equality between the sexes and gave everybody the vote and included Black and Native Americans in their polity. I think we should celebrate them as the heart of the American experience and something we're still trying to imitate. Now,